There's nothing quite like losing something you love more than life itself, the kind of loss that leaves a hollow ache in your chest every morning when you wake up, expecting to see what's no longer there. Henry Talbot knew this pain well. 3 years ago, his prized stallion Red Dust disappeared during a brutal winter storm in the New Mexico territory. The horse wasn't just his companion, he was Henry's heart, walking on 4 legs. Now, at 62, Henry's own spirit seemed as lost as his beloved horse. His ranch still prospered, his cattle still grazed the endless desert, but the fire in his soul had died with Red Dust. Then one morning in 1891, his wife Eleanor spotted a half-dead Mustang stumbling near their fence. "He looks like your dead horse," she said. Henry thought it was impossible, but something about this broken animal stirred memories he'd tried to bury. Could miracles still happen in the unforgiving West? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Talbot ranch as Henry stepped onto his porch, coffee cup in hand. The high desert of New Mexico territory stretched endlessly before him, painted in hues of rust and gold that most folks found beautiful. Henry barely noticed anymore. The vastness that once filled him with pride now felt empty, like looking at a painting with the centerpiece cut out. Eleanor emerged from the kitchen, her practical boots clicking against the wooden planks. At 58, she remained a handsome woman, though lines of worry had etched themselves deeper around her eyes these past 3 years. Her graying hair was pulled back in its usual no-nonsense bun, and she carried herself with the quiet strength that had first attracted Henry 25 years ago. "Miguel's bringing the horses in early today," she said, settling beside him on the porch swing they'd built together during their first year of marriage. "Says there's weather coming from the west." Henry nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. Miguel Hernandez had been their foreman for 15 years, and his weather sense was rarely wrong. The man understood this land the way Henry once understood horses, with an intuition that came from years of careful attention. The Jameson cattle broke through the south fence again, Eleanor continued, her tone carefully neutral. "Tommy's riding out to mend it this morning." Henry's jaw tightened slightly. Thomas McKenna was barely 19, eager and hard-working, but green as spring grass. Henry had hired him the previous summer, mostly because the boy reminded him of himself at that age, full of dreams about working with horses and living free under the big sky. Now Tommy spent most of his time mending fences and moving cattle, the same mundane work that kept a ranch running but never stirred a man's soul. "Should have Miguel check his work," Henry said finally. "That fence has been giving us trouble all season." Eleanor studied her husband's profile. Once, Henry Talbot had been the most respected horse trainer in 3 territories. Men would travel for weeks to have him break their difficult animals or to buy one of his carefully bred quarter horses. His reputation had built their prosperity. His passion had built their life together. Now he went through the motions of ranch management with the mechanical precision of a man whose heart had left the building. The swing creaked softly as they sat in comfortable silence. This had become their morning ritual coffee on the porch, discussing the day's necessities, avoiding the topic that hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Eleanor understood grief, but 3 years seemed long enough to mourn any creature, even one as special as Red Dust had been. She remembered the day Henry had first brought the young stallion home. Red Dust had been barely 2 years old, wild caught from a Mustang herd and sold to Henry by a government agent looking to clear grazing land. Most men would have seen a difficult, half-broke animal with uncertain bloodlines. Henry had seen poetry in motion. "Look at the way he carries himself," Henry had told her that first evening, leaning against the corral fence with wonder in his voice. "See how his ears are always moving, always listening. Most horses are content to follow. This one wants to lead." Red Dust had been magnificent, a deep chestnut with a blaze of white down his face and 4 white socks that made him look like he'd stepped through snow. But his color was the least remarkable thing about him. The horse had possessed an intelligence that bordered on supernatural and a loyalty to Henry that had made other ranchers shake their heads in amazement. Eleanor had watched their partnership develop over the years, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with a touch of jealousy she'd never admitted aloud. Henry and Red Dust had shared a language that needed no words. A slight shift in Henry's weight would send the horse into a perfect sliding stop. A barely perceptible touch of his heels would launch them into a gallop that looked like controlled flight. When Henry worked cattle, Red Dust would anticipate the movements of the stock almost before Henry saw them himself. But it was the quiet moments that had truly revealed their bond. Henry would often spend evenings in the stable, brushing Red Dust's coat while talking through the day's events. The horse would lower his great head and listen, occasionally nickering soft responses as if offering commentary. Eleanor would find them there sometimes, man and horse in perfect contentment, and feel like an intruder witnessing something sacred. The morning of the blizzard, Henry had ridden out early to check on cattle in the high pasture. Red Dust had been eager that day, dancing sideways and tossing his head as they left the yard. Eleanor had watched from the kitchen window, thinking how alive Henry looked when he was mounted on his favorite horse, younger, more purposeful, more himself than he ever seemed on foot. The storm had blown in faster and harder than anyone expected. By noon, the wind was howling like a living thing, and snow was falling so thick you couldn't see the barn from the house. Miguel had gathered the other hands and gone looking for Henry, but the visibility was near zero and the temperature dropping fast. Henry had returned alone just after dark, leading his backup mount and looking like he'd aged 10 years in a single day. Red Dust, he'd explained in short, broken sentences, had spooked at something in the whiteout, maybe a wolf, maybe just the wind. The horse had reared and pulled free from where Henry had ground-tied him, disappearing into the storm like a ghost. They'd searched for weeks once the weather cleared. Henry had ridden out every day, following every trail, checking every box canyon and hidden valley within 50 miles. He'd offered rewards that attracted drifters and fortune-seekers from as far away as Colorado. But the high desert was vast and unforgiving, full of places where a horse could disappear forever. Some of the search parties had found wolf sign, others had reported seeing eagles circling in distant valleys. Henry had refused to acknowledge what these signs might mean, continuing his daily rides long after everyone else had given up hope. Eleanor had watched him growing thinner and more distant, pouring his grief into futile searches that took him away from home for days at a time. The worst part had been clearing out Red Dust's stall. Henry had insisted on doing it himself, removing the worn leather halter that still hung from its peg, gathering the brushes and tools that had served no other horse. Eleanor had found him sitting in the empty stall one evening, holding that old halter and staring at nothing. He'd looked up at her with such raw pain that she'd felt her own heart break. "He's gone, Henry," she'd said gently. "You have to let him go." Henry had nodded, but something in him had gone into that empty stall and never come out. Now, 3 years later, Eleanor watched her husband's morning ritual of avoiding the stable altogether. He managed the ranch with competent detachment, made sound business decisions, and treated his remaining horses with professional care. But the passion was gone, the joy extinguished, the partnership between man and animal that had once defined him reduced to mere transaction. "I should check on that Mustang," Eleanor said suddenly, surprising herself. They'd spotted the half-dead animal 2 days ago, stumbling along their fence line like something out of a fever dream. Most ranchers would have put it out of its misery and been done with it, but something had stayed Henry's hand. "It's probably dead by now," Henry replied without much interest. "Might be, but if it's not, we can't just leave it there to suffer." Henry finished his coffee and stood. "I'll ride out after I talk to Miguel about the fence." Eleanor watched him walk toward the barn, noting how his shoulders seemed permanently set in a defensive hunch these days. At 62, Henry was still a strong man, still capable of a full day's work, but he moved like someone carrying a heavy load that never got lighter. She remained on the porch, watching the sun climb higher over the desert. 25 years of marriage had taught her patience, but she wondered sometimes if patience was the right response to a grief that seemed to be hardening into permanent sorrow. Henry had loved Red Dust deeply, but he'd loved her first and longer. Lately, she felt like she was competing with a ghost for her own husband's attention. The sound of hoofbeats drew her gaze to the corral, where Miguel was leading in the remuda for the day's work. The Mexican had been born on this land when it was still part of his country, and he understood its moods and seasons better than any man Eleanor knew. He'd been one of Henry's few friends who'd never suggested that 3 years of mourning was excessive, never implied that Red Dust had been just a horse. Tommy emerged from the bunkhouse, his young face eager despite the early hour. The boy hero worshipped Henry, though he was too polite to show it openly. Eleanor suspected he'd heard stories about Henry's reputation with horses and hoped to learn some of that magic himself. What he'd found instead was a competent but distant boss who treated him with professional courtesy and nothing more. The morning routine played out with familiar efficiency. Miguel assigned tasks, horses were saddled, and the men dispersed to their various duties. Henry emerged from the barn mounted on his current favorite, a solid bay gelding named Marshall, a good horse, reliable and well-trained, but lacking the fire that had made Red Dust special. Eleanor made her own preparations for the day, tending to her garden and planning the week's meals. She'd adapted to ranch life with the same practical determination she brought to everything, learning to preserve food, manage accounts, and handle the 100 small crises that arose when you lived 40 miles from the nearest town. But she'd never quite adapted to the loneliness that seemed to permeate their home these days. By mid-morning, she found herself walking toward the south pasture where they'd spotted the dying Mustang. She told herself it was simple humanitarian concern, but something deeper was pulling her forward, perhaps the same instinct that had made her point out the animal's resemblance to Red Dust in the first place. The Mustang was still alive, barely. It lay beneath a twisted juniper tree, its sides rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. Close up, Eleanor could see why the comparison had leaped so readily to her lips. The horse was clearly a chestnut beneath the dust and matted hair, with white markings that might have been similar to Red Dust's distinctive pattern. But where Red Dust had been magnificent in his prime, this animal was a wreck, starved, dehydrated, and marked with old scars that spoke of a hard life in the wild. Still, something about the way he held his head, even in extremity, reminded her powerfully of Henry's lost companion. The same proud bearing, the same alert ears tracking every sound. When the Mustang opened his eyes and looked directly at her, Eleanor felt a strange chill run down her spine. Those eyes, dark, brown, intelligent, and somehow familiar, seemed to be asking for something more than mere mercy. Eleanor found herself kneeling beside the suffering animal, her practical nature warring with an impulse she couldn't quite name. The horse was probably beyond saving, certainly beyond any reasonable effort. But as she looked into those knowing eyes, she thought about her husband's empty stall and wondered if sometimes the impossible was exactly what a broken heart needed most. When Eleanor returned to the house an hour later, she found Henry sitting at the kitchen table with his ledger books spread before him. Numbers and calculations covered the pages in his careful handwriting: feed costs, cattle prices, seasonal projections, the mundane mathematics of survival that had replaced the poetry of his former life. "That Mustang's still breathing," she announced without preamble. Henry looked up from his figures, pencil suspended over a column of expenses. "Won't be for long, maybe not. But he's fighting harder than you'd expect." Something in her tone made Henry set down his pencil. Eleanor wasn't given to sentiment about animals. She appreciated their utility, cared for their welfare, but she'd never shared his deeper connection to horses. Her mention of the Mustang fighting felt significant in a way he couldn't quite grasp. Eleanor, if you're thinking we should— I'm not thinking anything, she interrupted, hanging her shawl on its peg by the door. Just telling you what I saw. That horse has been half dead for 2 days now, but he's still trying. Makes a person wonder what's keeping him going. Henry returned to his ledger, but the numbers swam before his eyes. He'd spent 3 years building careful walls around certain thoughts, certain possibilities. The discipline had become automatic, a survival mechanism as essential as breathing. But Eleanor's words had cracked something in those defenses. "Probably just stubborn," he said finally. "Some horses are too mean to die easy." Eleanor moved around the kitchen with her usual efficiency, preparing the midday meal and organizing supplies for the week ahead. But she kept glancing at Henry, noting the tension in his shoulders and the way his pencil had stopped moving across the page. "Miguel's worried about you," she said casually, as if commenting on the weather. This brought Henry's head up sharply. Miguel Hernandez was not a man given to worry about anything beyond horses, cattle, and weather. If he was expressing concern about his employer, something had shifted in the careful balance of their working relationship. "Miguel's got no cause to worry about me. Says you've been distracted lately, making decisions and then changing them. Yesterday you told him to move the cattle to the north pasture. Then an hour later you told Tommy to keep them south." Henry frowned. He had no memory of contradicting himself, but the past few days had felt strangely unsettled. Since Eleanor had first mentioned the Mustang's resemblance to red dust, his concentration had been scattered, his thoughts drifting toward subjects he'd trained himself to avoid. "I've got a lot on my mind." "I know you do." Eleanor's voice carried a gentleness that surprised him. "That's why maybe you should put that animal out of its misery and be done with it. No sense letting it suffer just because it reminds us of something we can't have back." The words hit Henry like a physical blow. Eleanor had voiced the thought he'd been refusing to acknowledge, that his reluctance to end the Mustang's suffering had nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with the painful resemblance she'd pointed out. The admission felt like betraying both his lost horse and his own hard-won emotional discipline. "You're right," he said, closing the ledger with more force than necessary. "I'll take care of it this afternoon." Eleanor watched him stand and reach for his hat, noting the way his jaw had set in that stubborn line she knew so well. But instead of leaving immediately, Henry paused at the door, his hand on the knob. "What exactly did you mean when you said he looks like red dust?" The question hung in the kitchen air between them. Eleanor had been hoping he wouldn't ask, knowing that any answer would force them both to confront the resemblance that had been haunting her thoughts since she'd first seen the dying animal. The coloring mostly, chestnut with white markings, same general build. "Lots of horses match that description." "Yes," Eleanor agreed quietly. "Lots of horses do." But her tone suggested there was more to it than general resemblance, and Henry found himself caught between desperate curiosity and the fear of hoping for something impossible. 3 years of careful emotional management had taught him that hope was more dangerous than despair. Despair, at least, was predictable. "I should get this over with," he said, opening the door. "Henry." Eleanor's voice stopped him on the threshold. "Maybe you should look at him properly before you make any decisions. I've seen him. Half-dead Mustang, probably been running wild for years. Nothing special about that." "No," Eleanor said carefully. "Nothing special at all." The walk to the south pasture felt longer than usual, each step weighted with a reluctance Henry couldn't quite name. He'd put down injured animals before it was an unavoidable part of ranch life. But this felt different, freighted with meanings he wasn't ready to examine. The Mustang lay in the same spot where Eleanor had found him, but his position had changed slightly. His head was raised now, ears pricked forward as if listening for something. When Henry approached, the horse's dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him falter mid-step. For a moment, the years collapsed. He was looking at eyes he'd looked into 1,000 times, eyes that had held the same alert intelligence, the same depth of understanding. The Mustang's condition was pitiable rib showing, coat dull with dust and neglect, old scars visible through the matted hair. But something in his bearing, even flat on the ground and dying, spoke of nobility that suffering couldn't quite erase. Henry forced himself to move closer, to see the animal clearly, rather than through the lens of wishful thinking. The white markings were similar to red dust's, but not identical. The build was right, but 3 years of hard living could change any horse's appearance. Most telling of all, this Mustang was clearly several years older than Red Dust would be now, his muzzle showing grey that spoke of middle age rather than prime. The relief that washed over Henry was almost overwhelming. This wasn't Red Dust. This was just a dying horse that happened to bear a superficial resemblance to his lost companion. He could do what needed doing, without the weight of impossible hope complicating the task. He knelt beside the Mustang, checking for obvious injuries or signs of disease that might make the animal dangerous. The horse watched him steadily, but made no attempt to move, either too weak to flee or too resigned to try. Henry's hands found the predictable problems: dehydration, malnutrition, infected cuts from thorns and rocks. But as his examination continued, details began to accumulate that made his certainty waver. A scar along the right shoulder that looked like it might have come from barbed wire. The particular way the horse's left ear had a small notch in it, as if from an old injury. The exact pattern of white on the front legs that formed an almost perfect match to memories Henry had tried so hard to bury. "Easy, boy," Henry heard himself saying, using the same gentle tone he'd once used with Red Dust. "Nobody's going to hurt you." The Mustang's ears flicked forward at the sound of his voice, and something that might have been recognition flickered in those dark eyes. Henry told himself he was imagining it, projecting his own desperate wishes onto a dying animal. But when he moved his hand toward the horse's neck, the Mustang turned his head slightly, exposing the exact spot where Red Dust had always loved to be scratched. Henry's hand trembled as he touched the matted coat. The Mustang relaxed under the contact, breathing out a long sigh that sounded achingly familiar. For 3 years, Henry had heard that particular sound in his dreams, the contented exhalation Red Dust had always made when his favorite person was near. "This is impossible," Henry whispered, more to himself than to the horse. "You can't be—" But even as his rational mind insisted on impossibility, his hands were already moving with practiced efficiency, checking the Mustang's vital signs and assessing what it would take to save him. The horse was dehydrated but not beyond recovery, starved but not skeletal, exhausted but still possessed of a spark that suggested he wanted to live. Henry found himself thinking about water and feed, about the empty stall back at the ranch that hadn't housed a horse in 3 years, about the leather halter hanging unused on its peg and the brushes that had gathered dust since Red Dust's disappearance. "What am I doing?" he asked aloud, but his hands were already sliding under the Mustang's head and shoulders, testing whether the animal could support its own weight. The horse struggled to rise, legs trembling with effort, but managed to get his front end up. Henry moved to support the hindquarters, and together they managed to get the Mustang to his feet. Standing, the resemblance to Red Dust was even more pronounced. The same proud carriage, the same way of holding his head as if surveying his domain. Henry told himself he was acting out of simple compassion, that any decent man would try to save a horse that could still be saved. But as he fashioned a makeshift halter from his rope and began the slow walk back to the ranch, he knew he was lying to himself. This wasn't about mercy or kindness or even general love of horses. This was about hope, dangerous, irrational, probably doomed hope that had been lurking in his heart since Eleanor first spoke those fateful words. "He looks like your dead horse." The Mustang followed him with surprising docility, as if he understood that his survival depended on trust. When they reached the main corral, Miguel emerged from the barn, took one look at the scene, and shook his head. "Señor Henry, what are you doing?" "Saving a horse. That horse is half dead. Better to put him out of his misery. Maybe, but not today." Miguel studied his employer's face and saw something there that made him bite back further arguments. In 15 years of working for Henry Talbot, he'd learned to recognize the signs of a man making a decision that couldn't be talked out of. "Where you want him?" Henry looked toward the barn, toward the empty stall he'd avoided for 3 years. His father's old branding iron hung on the wall nearby, unused since the last time he'd marked a horse as his own. The sight of it made something twist in his chest. "The end stall. And Miguel, get some water and feed ready. This horse is going to live." Miguel nodded, though his expression suggested he thought his boss might be losing his mind. "Si, patron. Whatever you say." As they led the Mustang into the barn, Henry caught sight of Eleanor, watching from the house. Even at a distance, he could see the tension in her posture, the way she held herself when she was worried about him making a mistake she'd have to help him live with. Maybe this was a mistake. Probably it was. But as the Mustang walked into Red Dust's old stall and immediately moved to the corner where the water bucket had always hung, Henry felt something in his chest that he'd almost forgotten, the dangerous, wonderful sensation of believing that impossible things might sometimes turn out to be true. 2 weeks passed in a blur of careful nursing and cautious hope. The Mustang's recovery progressed faster than anyone had expected, his constitution proving stronger than his initial condition suggested. Henry found himself spending hours in the barn, monitoring the horse's progress with an attention to detail that bordered on obsession. Eleanor watched this transformation with mixed feelings. She hadn't seen Henry this engaged with anything in 3 years, but she recognized the dangerous territory he was entering. The careful emotional distance he'd maintained since Red Dust's disappearance was crumbling, replaced by an investment that could lead to either healing or deeper heartbreak. "He's looking better," she observed one morning, finding Henry brushing the Mustang's coat with patient strokes. The horse's ribs were no longer visible, and his coat was beginning to show hints of the deep chestnut color that lay beneath years of desert dust. "Good feed and regular care," Henry replied without looking up. "Any horse will improve under the right conditions." But Eleanor could see it was more than that. Henry was using brushes he hadn't touched in years, following routines he'd abandoned when Red Dust disappeared. The Mustang stood quietly under his ministrations, occasionally turning his head to nuzzle Henry's shoulder in a gesture of affection that made Eleanor's heart skip. "Miguel says you've been out here past midnight 3 times this week." Henry's brushstrokes paused. "Horse needed watching. First few days are crucial with an animal in this condition." "The first few days were 2 weeks ago, Henry." He resumed brushing, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders. She'd known him long enough to recognize when he was avoiding a conversation that needed having. "Found something yesterday," Henry said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "When I was cleaning out that old desk in the study." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a faded daguerreotype, its edges soft with age. The photograph showed a younger Henry standing beside a magnificent chestnut stallion, both of them captured in a moment of perfect partnership. Red Dust's head was turned toward the camera, ears pricked forward, while Henry's hand rested on the horse's neck with casual familiarity. Eleanor took the photograph, studying the faces of both man and horse. Henry looked impossibly young, his hair still dark, and his face unmarked by the lines that grief had etched there. But it was Red Dust who commanded attention every inch, the magnificent animal Henry had described in countless stories over the years. "When was this taken?" she asked. "Summer of '85. Red Dust was 4 years old, just coming into his prime. That was the year I started thinking he might be something special." Eleanor looked from the photograph to the Mustang, who was watching their conversation with alert interest. The resemblance was undeniable, not just in coloring but in bearing. In the particular way, both horses held their heads and focused their attention. "Henry," she began carefully, "you know this can't be. I know what's possible and what isn't." Henry interrupted, taking the photograph back and returning it to his pocket. "I'm not a fool, Eleanor. I'm just taking care of a horse that needed help." But even as he spoke, his hand moved unconsciously to scratch the Mustang behind the ears, finding the exact spot that had always been Red Dust's favorite. The horse leaned into the touch with a familiarity that made Eleanor's breath catch. Miguel appeared in the barn doorway, hat in hand and expression apologetic. "Senor Henry, sorry to interrupt, but there's a man here to see you. Says he's from the territorial government." Henry frowned. Government visits were rarely good news for ranchers, especially when they came unannounced. "What's he want?" "Wouldn't say. But he's got papers with him, and he's been asking questions about missing livestock." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Missing livestock investigations often meant questions about ownership, brands, and the legal status of animals that might have changed hands under questionable circumstances. "I'll be right there," Henry said, giving the Mustang a final pat. But as he turned to leave, the horse nickered softly, a low, musical sound that stopped Henry in his tracks. Eleanor saw her husband's face go pale. She'd heard that same sound countless times over the years, always when Red Dust was trying to get Henry's attention or express contentment. It was a distinctive vocalization, unlike anything she'd heard from their other horses. "Henry?" she said quietly. He shook his head as if clearing it, then strode toward the barn door with determined steps. "Government business won't wait." The territorial representative turned out to be a thin, officious man named Collins, who carried himself with the self-importance of someone who rarely left his office. He sat uncomfortably on the Talbots' front porch, sweat staining his city clothes despite the morning coolness. "Mr. Talbot, I'm investigating reports of missing horses in this region, specifically animals that may have been taken by raiders or rustlers over the past several years." Henry settled into his chair with the easy confidence of a man on his own property. "What's that got to do with me?" Collins consulted his papers. "We've had reports of a distinctive chestnut stallion that disappeared from a ranch north of here about 3 years ago. Owners offering a substantial reward for information." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. 3 years ago, exactly when Red Dust had vanished. But Henry's expression remained carefully neutral. "Lot of chestnut horses in this territory, Mr. Collins. Happens to be a popular color." "Yes, but this particular animal had distinctive markings. White blaze, 4 white socks, specific scars from an old injury. The owner provided detailed descriptions." Henry's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And you think I might have seen this horse?" "I think you might currently have this horse, Mr. Talbot. My sources tell me you recently acquired a Mustang matching this description." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Eleanor watched her husband's face, seeing the careful control that had carried him through 3 years of grief, beginning to crack under pressure. "My sources," Henry said slowly, "would be mistaken about the circumstances of that acquisition. Perhaps you could show me the animal in question, just to eliminate any confusion." Henry stood, his movement deliberate and measured. "Mr. Collins, I've been ranching in this territory for 25 years. My reputation for honest dealing is well established. If you want to see my horses, you're welcome to look, but I won't be questioned like a common thief on my own property." Collins had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I meant no offense, Mr. Talbot, but you understand I have to investigate these reports." The walk to the barn felt like a funeral procession. Eleanor found herself holding her breath as Henry led the way, wondering what Collins would make of the Mustang and whether the similarities to Red Dust would be obvious to a stranger's eye. The Mustang was standing alert in his stall when they arrived, as if he'd been listening to their approach. Collins stepped forward, consulting his papers and comparing them to the horse before him. "Coloring's right," he murmured. "Build looks about right too. Mind if I take a closer look?" Henry nodded, though Eleanor could see the tension radiating from him. Collins entered the stall with the cautious movements of a man not entirely comfortable around horses. The Mustang stood quietly, allowing the examination, but keeping his attention fixed on Henry. "Interesting," Collins said, running his hands along the horse's legs. "These white markings are quite distinctive, and this scar here looks like it could match the description I was given." Eleanor saw Henry's hands clench into fists at his sides. The suggestion that this horse might be someone else's property, might be taken away just as he was beginning to hope again, was clearly more than he could bear. "Scars from barbed wire are common enough," Henry said carefully. "Any horse that's spent time running wild is going to have marks like that." Collins continued his examination, making notes and comparing details to his paperwork. The Mustang endured the attention with patient resignation, but Eleanor noticed how the horse's ears kept tracking Henry's movements, how he seemed most relaxed when Henry was in his line of sight. "Tell me about how you acquired this animal," Collins said finally. Henry's voice was steady when he answered. "Found him dying on my property 2 weeks ago. Half-starved, dehydrated, barely alive. Nursed him back to health out of simple decency. No bill of sale? No transfer of ownership documents?" "Mr. Collins, when you find a dying animal on your own land, you don't ask for paperwork before you try to save its life." Collins made more notes, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but determined to complete his investigation. "The thing is, Mr. Talbot, the description I have matches this horse very closely, and the timing of your finding him coincides with renewed search efforts by the original owner." "Original owner of what?" Henry's voice carried a dangerous edge. "That horse came onto my property as a stray, under territorial law that makes him mine if no one can prove otherwise." "That's true, but if someone can prove ownership, then let them prove it." Henry stepped closer to Collins, his size and presence suddenly seeming much more formidable. "Until then, this is my horse, on my property, and I'll thank you not to suggest otherwise." Collins gathered his papers hastily. "Of course, Mr. Talbot, I was just doing my job. But if the original owner comes forward with proper documentation, he'll find me ready to discuss the matter like a reasonable man," Henry finished. "But not before." After Collins left, Henry remained in the barn, staring at the Mustang who had inadvertently become the center of a legal challenge. Eleanor joined him, both of them silent as they contemplated the implications of the government man's visit. "What if someone really can prove ownership?" Eleanor asked finally. Henry's hand found the Mustang's neck, stroking the coat that had regained its shine under his care. The horse leaned into the touch, displaying the kind of trust that usually took months to develop. "Then I suppose I'll have to face that when it happens," he said quietly. "But until then, this horse stays here. He's been through enough." Eleanor watched the interaction between her husband and the Mustang, noting details that Collins had missed in his official examination. The way the horse responded to Henry's voice, the familiar gestures of affection, the sense of partnership that seemed to exist despite their short acquaintance. 3 years ago, she would have dismissed such thoughts as wishful thinking. But standing in the barn, watching Henry come alive again in ways she'd thought were lost forever, Eleanor found herself wondering if sometimes the impossible might wear the disguise of the merely improbable. The Mustang nickered again, that distinctive sound that raised goosebumps on her arms. In response, Henry reached into his pocket and withdrew the old photograph, studying it by the barn's lamplight. "Some things," he said to no one in particular, "are worth fighting for, regardless of the odds." The Mustang's transformation over the following week was nothing short of remarkable. With regular feeding and careful attention, his true nature began to emerge from beneath the ravages of his hard life in the wild. His coat gained luster, revealing the deep chestnut color that had caught Eleanor's attention from the beginning. More importantly, his personality started to shine, through intelligent, alert, and possessed of a dignity that no amount of hardship had been able to diminish. Henry found himself drawn to the barn at all hours, often arriving before dawn to check on his patient and staying well past the time when sensible men retired for the evening. He told himself it was necessary vigilance, that a horse recovering from such severe condition required constant monitoring. But Eleanor knew better. She recognized the symptoms of a man falling in love with a horse all over again. "He's getting strong enough to turn out," Miguel observed one morning as they watched the Mustang pace restlessly in his stall. "That's a good sign, but he's going to need exercise soon." Henry nodded. though the thought of letting the horse out of the protected environment of the barn filled him with anxiety. What if the Mustang decided to leave? What if his recovery had been motivated by nothing more than survival instinct, and freedom would call him back to the wild? Maybe another few days, Henry said. Want to make sure he's fully recovered before we give him that kind of choice. Miguel gave him a knowing look, but said nothing. In his 15 years working for the Talbots, he'd learned to recognize when his employer was avoiding a decision he wasn't ready to make. Eleanor emerged from the house, carrying a bucket of warm water and clean rags. "Thought I'd help with his grooming today," she announced. "That coat needs proper attention if we're going to see what we're really dealing with." Henry stepped back to give her room, watching as she approached the Mustang with the same no-nonsense competence she brought to everything. The horse accepted her attention calmly, though his ears remained focused on Henry's location throughout the process. As Eleanor worked, methodically cleaning away the accumulated dust and debris of months in the wild, details emerged that made Henry's breath catch. A distinctive cowlick on the horse's forehead that formed an almost perfect star. The exact pattern of darker chestnut around his muzzle that had always made Red Dust look like he was smiling. Most unsettling of all, a jagged piece of rusted wire embedded deep in the muscle of his left shoulder, old enough to be partially healed over, but recent enough to suggest it hadn't been there since birth. "Henry," Eleanor said quietly, her fingers tracing the wire's outline. "This needs to come out. It's probably been causing him pain." Henry moved closer, examining the foreign object with hands that had treated similar injuries countless times over the years. The wire was barbed, the kind used for fencing, and it had penetrated deep enough to require careful extraction. But something about its position and angle triggered a memory that made his hands tremble. 3 winters ago, during the search for Red Dust, they'd found a section of fence that had been broken through with tremendous force. The wooden posts had been snapped, the wire pulled tight, and twisted into sharp coils that could easily have injured a panicked horse. Henry had assumed at the time that Red Dust had simply run into the fence during the blizzard, but now he wondered if his horse had been trying to escape something or return to something. "We'll need to sedate him for this," Henry said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Can't risk him thrashing around with wire that close to major blood vessels." Eleanor studied her husband's face, noting the pallor and the way his jaw was working, as if he was chewing on words he couldn't quite speak. "Henry, what is it?" "Nothing. Just that wire could have killed him if it had gone a few inches in either direction. Lucky horse." But luck seemed an inadequate explanation for everything about this Mustang. Lucky that he'd survived 3 years in the wild with a piece of barbed wire lodged in his shoulder. Lucky that he'd found his way to the Talbot Ranch just when Henry was finally ready to hope again. Lucky that his recovery had progressed so smoothly despite his initial condition. The sedation process went more easily than expected. The Mustang accepted the halter without resistance and stood quietly while Henry prepared the injection. But as the medicine began to take effect, the horse's legs started to buckle and he began to fall. Henry moved instinctively to support him, and the Mustang's head came to rest against his chest in a gesture so familiar it took Henry's breath away. Red Dust had always done that when he was tired or uncertain, seeking comfort in the one human he trusted completely. "Easy, boy," Henry murmured, the endearment slipping out before he could stop it. "I've got you." The wire extraction proved more complicated than expected. The barbed metal had worked its way deep into the muscle tissue, creating a web of scar tissue that had to be carefully cut away. But as Henry worked, following the wire's path through the horse's shoulder, he found something that made his hands freeze mid-motion. Beneath the wire, partially obscured by scar tissue but still clearly visible, was the faint outline of a brand mark. Not the random scarring he'd expected, but the deliberate pattern of hot iron pressed to hide. Someone had tried to obliterate this mark, but time and the horse's own healing had revealed edges of the original design. Henry's mouth went dry as he recognized the pattern. It was his father's brand, the distinctive T with a small star above it that had marked Talbot horses for 2 generations. The same brand he'd put on Red Dust as a 2-year-old, the same mark that had been registered with the territorial authorities as proof of ownership. "Eleanor," he said quietly, his voice barely steady. "Come look at this." Eleanor peered over his shoulder, following his pointing finger to the partially revealed brand. Her sharp intake of breath told him she recognized it too, had seen it on enough Talbot horses over the years to know it immediately. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I know, Henry. That wire was put there deliberately. Someone tried to hide that brand." The implications hit him like a physical blow. If someone had deliberately obscured Red Dust's brand, it meant the horse hadn't simply wandered away during the blizzard. He'd been taken, stolen, and whoever had taken him had tried to eliminate any proof of his original ownership. "Who would do such a thing?" Eleanor asked, but even as she spoke they both knew the answer. Horse thieves were not uncommon in the territory, and a stallion of Red Dust's quality would have been worth a substantial sum. The blizzard would have provided perfect cover for theft, with searchers assuming the horse had simply been lost to the storm. Henry completed the wire extraction in silence, his mind racing through the implications of what they'd discovered. If this really was Red Dust, then he'd spent 3 years mourning a horse who'd been alive but captive. 3 years of grief that could have been 3 years of searching, of hope, of fighting to get him back. As the sedation wore off, the Mustang struggled to his feet with Henry's help. The removal of the wire seemed to have given him immediate relief. He moved more freely, his head carried higher, his entire demeanor more confident than before. "We need to report this to the territorial authorities," Eleanor said, but Henry was already shaking his head. "Report what? That we found an old brand mark under some wire? Collins would say we put it there ourselves to support a false claim. But if this is really Red Dust, then someone stole him and tried to hide the evidence. Someone who might still be out there, who might try to take him again if they know he's alive." Eleanor saw the protective anger building in her husband's eyes and felt a chill of apprehension. Henry had always been a peaceful man, slow to anger and quick to find reasonable solutions to problems. But the thought of someone deliberately taking Red Dust, of 3 years of unnecessary grief, was awakening something darker in him. "What are you thinking?" she asked carefully. "I'm thinking this horse stays here, where I can protect him, and I'm thinking I want to know who put that wire in his shoulder." The Mustang, fully recovered from the sedation now, moved to the stall door and nickered softly. It was the same sound Henry had heard countless times before Red Dust's way of asking for attention when he felt neglected. Without thinking, Henry reached out and scratched behind the horse's ears, finding the exact spot that had always been most sensitive. The Mustang leaned into the touch, closing his eyes with contentment that seemed to come from deep familiarity rather than recent gratitude. "Hello, old friend," Henry whispered, the words barely audible even to Eleanor. "I've missed you." For the first time in 3 years, speaking those words didn't feel like talking to a ghost. The horse standing before him was real, warm, responsive to his touch in ways that no stranger could fake. The brand mark, partially hidden though it was, provided tangible proof of what his heart had been trying to tell him since Eleanor first mentioned the resemblance. This was Red Dust. Against all odds, through circumstances he couldn't yet understand, his beloved horse had found his way home. Eleanor watched the reunion with tears in her eyes, seeing her husband's face transform as years of carefully suppressed grief gave way to wonder and joy. But even in the midst of this miracle, she couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were just beginning. Someone had taken Red Dust and tried to hide his identity, someone who might still consider the horse valuable enough to steal again. And now that Henry had his companion back, she knew with absolute certainty that he would fight anyone who tried to separate them, regardless of the cost to himself or his family. The Mustang Red Dust pressed his head against Henry's shoulder in the old familiar gesture of affection. After 3 years of absence, the bond between them seemed as strong as ever, as if no time had passed at all. Outside the barn, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and Eleanor couldn't help but feel they were an omen of troubles yet to come. The days following the discovery of the brand mark passed in a haze of renewed purpose for Henry. He found himself studying red dust with the intensity of a man trying to reconcile 3 years of grief with the miracle standing before him. Every familiar gesture, every recognizable habit added another layer of certainty to what his heart already knew. Eleanor watched this transformation with growing concern. While she rejoiced in seeing her husband's spirit restored, she recognized the dangerous territory they were entering. Henry's protective instincts had always been strong, but now they carried the edge of a man who'd lost something precious once and would not allow it to happen again. "You need to be careful how you talk about this horse," she warned him one morning as they shared coffee on the porch. "Word travels fast in this territory, and if the wrong people hear that red dust has returned—" "I haven't told anyone anything," Henry replied, but his tone carried a defensiveness that suggested he was fighting his own impulses. The urge to share his joy, to tell the world that miracles could still happen, was warring with the practical need for secrecy. "Miguel knows something's different, and Tommy's been asking questions about why you spend so much time in the barn." Henry's jaw tightened. Tommy McKenna was a good boy, but he was young and prone to gossip when he rode into town on weekends. The last thing they needed was stories spreading about the Talbot Ranch's mysterious new horse. "I'll talk to them both. Make sure they understand the importance of keeping family business private." Eleanor nodded, but she could see the strain in her husband's face. Keeping such a momentous secret was asking a lot of a man who'd been living with the weight of loss for 3 years. The temptation to celebrate, to vindicate his faith in front of all the neighbors who'd told him to give up hope, must be almost overwhelming. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A rider was coming up the main road at a pace that suggested urgency rather than social calling. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. Unexpected visitors had brought nothing but trouble lately. The rider turned out to be Bill Harrison, a rancher from 30 miles north whose spread bordered the territorial road. Harrison was a practical man, not given to unnecessary travel, and his presence on the Talbot Ranch could only mean serious business. "Henry," Harrison called as he dismounted near the porch. "Need to talk to you about something important." "Bill, what brings you out this way?" Harrison removed his hat and wiped sweat from his forehead despite the morning coolness. "Had a visit yesterday from a man claiming to be looking for stolen horses. Said he'd traced some missing stock to this area and was checking with all the local ranchers." Eleanor felt her blood turn cold. The government investigator Collins had been just the beginning. Now private parties were getting involved in the search. "What kind of horses?" Henry asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Chestnut stallion mainly. Described it in detail, white markings, specific scars, the whole thing, offering a substantial reward for information leading to recovery." Henry's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "This man have a name?" "Called himself Davidson. Big fellow, well-dressed, had the look of money about him. But Harrison's voice dropped lower. Something about him didn't sit right. Asked too many questions about your place specifically. Seemed to know more about your business than a stranger ought to." The implications hit Henry like a physical blow. Someone wasn't just looking for red dust, they were targeting the Talbot Ranch specifically. Which meant whoever had taken his horse 3 years ago knew exactly where he'd ended up. "What kind of questions?" Eleanor asked, stepping closer to her husband. "Wanted to know about your horse operation, how many animals you keep, whether you'd acquired any new stock recently." When I told him Henry wasn't in the horse business much anymore, he seemed surprised, like he expected different information. Henry's mind raced through the possibilities. If Davidson knew to look for red dust at the Talbot Ranch, it could only mean one of two things. Either he was the original thief, or he was working for whoever had taken the horse. Either way, his presence in the area meant danger. "Appreciate the warning, Bill," Henry said finally. "This Davidson say where he was staying?" "Mentioned the hotel in Las Cruces. Said he'd be in the area for several days, talking to all the ranchers." Harrison studied Henry's face carefully. "Henry, if there's something you need to tell me about this situation." "Nothing to tell, just grateful to have neighbors who look out for each other." Harrison nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. He'd known Henry Talbot for 15 years, and something about his old friend's manner was setting off warning bells. After Harrison left, Henry and Eleanor sat in tense silence on the porch. The peaceful morning had been shattered by the reality of external threats, and both of them were grappling with the implications. "We need to get Red Dust somewhere safe," Henry said finally. "Where would be safer than here? This is his home. Not if Davidson decides to search the ranch. We need somewhere isolated, somewhere we can keep him hidden until we figure out what we're dealing with." Eleanor studied her husband's profile, noting the set of his jaw and the distant look in his eyes. She'd seen that expression before, when Henry was planning something that he knew she wouldn't like. "What are you thinking?" "The old line camp up in Copper Canyon. It's been abandoned for years, but the corral's still sound. Miguel and I could take Red Dust up there, keep him out of sight, until this blows over." "Henry, that's 40 miles of rough country, and if someone really is looking for him, splitting up just makes us more vulnerable. Makes him more vulnerable if we keep him here, where anyone can find him." Eleanor could see the protective instincts taking over, the same fierce determination that had kept Henry searching long after everyone else had given up hope. But she also saw the potential for mistakes born of desperation. "Maybe we should consider other options. Contact the territorial authorities ourselves, file an official claim. With what proof? A partially hidden brand mark that any skilled lawyer could argue was forged?" "Eleanor, if Davidson really is working for whoever took Red Dust, he'll have documentation that makes his claim look legitimate. We can't fight this through official channels." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their debate. Miguel and Tommy were returning from their morning rounds, and their timing couldn't have been better. Henry needed to brief them on the new threat and ensure their absolute discretion. But as the two ranch hands drew closer, Eleanor noticed something that made her heart sink. Tommy was riding alongside a stranger, a well-dressed man on a quality horse, who had the bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. "Henry," she whispered urgently, "I think Davidson just found us." The stranger dismounted with the fluid grace of an experienced horseman, his expensive boots and tailored clothes marking him as someone with substantial means. He was a large man, as Harrison had described, with the kind of presence that commanded attention even in casual situations. "Mr. Talbot?" Davidson's voice carried the slight accent of an educated Easterner. "I'm James Davidson. I believe we need to discuss a horse." Henry rose slowly from his chair, moving with the deliberate control of a man fighting his own instincts. "Mr. Davidson, I understand you've been asking questions about my livestock. Among other things, I represent certain interests that have been tracking stolen property through this territory. I have reason to believe you may have information relevant to my investigation." The formal language didn't hide the underlying threat. Davidson was here to reclaim Red Dust, and his confidence suggested he had the legal authority to do so. "You're welcome to look around," Henry said carefully, "but I'm not sure what information I could provide about stolen horses." Davidson smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I think you'd be surprised what information you might have, Mr. Talbot. For instance, I'm told you recently acquired a chestnut stallion matching the description of a very valuable animal that disappeared from the Rawlings Ranch 3 years ago." Eleanor felt the world shift around her. The Rawlings Ranch, she knew that name. James Rawlings had been one of Henry's competitors in the horse business, a man who'd always resented Henry's reputation and success. If Rawlings was claiming Red Dust had been stolen from him, "I found a half-dead Mustang on my property," Henry said slowly. "Nursed him back to health out of simple decency. That hardly constitutes theft." Of course not, but if that Mustang happens to be carrying a Rawlings brand, then we have a different situation entirely. Henry's blood ran cold. If Davidson was confident enough to make that statement, it meant he knew about the altered brand, knew that evidence of Red Dust's original ownership had been deliberately concealed. "I think you'd better come inside, Mr. Davidson," Henry said finally. "This conversation requires more privacy than a front porch provides." As they moved toward the house, Eleanor caught her husband's eye and saw the same realization she was grappling with. This wasn't a simple case of mistaken identity or competing claims. Someone had orchestrated an elaborate theft 3 years ago, complete with forged documentation and planted evidence. And now they were back to finish what they'd started. Red Dust was still in danger, but this time the threat came with legal documents and the backing of territorial law. Fighting it would require more than determination. It would require proof of a conspiracy that reached deeper than either of them had imagined. In his study, Henry reached for the small silver-inlaid bit that had been Red Dust's favorite piece of tack. Hidden away in a drawer for 3 years, it represented the one piece of evidence that might prove his horse's true identity. But using it would mean revealing his certainty that the Mustang was Red Dust, a revelation that could either save them or destroy everything they'd worked to protect. Davidson's presence in their home felt like a violation, but Henry forced himself to maintain the facade of cooperation. The next few hours would determine whether he got to keep his horse or lost him forever to the machinations of men who saw animals as nothing more than valuable property to be bought, sold, and stolen at will. Outside, storm clouds continued to gather, and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the weather was the least of their problems. Inside Henry's study, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Davidson settled into the offered chair with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way, while Henry remained standing behind his desk, a subtle assertion of authority on his own property. "Mr. Talbot, let me be direct," Davidson began, removing a leather portfolio from his coat. 3 years ago, a valuable stallion was stolen from the Rawlings ranch during a winter storm. The theft was carefully planned to coincide with severe weather that would hamper immediate pursuit. Henry's expression remained carefully neutral, but Eleanor could see the muscles in his jaw working. "I'm sorry to hear about Mr. Rawlings' loss, but I fail to see how it concerns me. The horse in question was a chestnut stallion with distinctive white markings, registered bloodlines, and considerable value. Mr. Rawlings has reason to believe this animal has been located on your property." Davidson opened his portfolio and withdrew several documents. "These are copies of the original registration papers, detailed descriptions of identifying marks, and sworn affidavits from witnesses who can testify to the horse's appearance and training." Eleanor moved closer to examine the papers, her heart sinking as she recognized the level of preparation Davidson had brought to this confrontation. The documents looked official and comprehensive, exactly the kind of evidence that would carry weight with territorial authorities. "Mr. Davidson," Henry said slowly, "I've already told your government friend Collins that the horse I found was a dying Mustang. I have no registration papers because there was nothing to register, just an act of mercy toward a suffering animal." "Yes, about Mr. Collins." Davidson's smile was thin and cold. "I'm afraid his investigation was somewhat premature. You see, Mr. Rawlings wasn't ready to make his claim public until he'd gathered all the necessary evidence." "Evidence of what, exactly?" "Evidence that his stolen horse was deliberately altered to hide its identity, then allowed to run wild until such time as it could be rescued by someone who would claim salvage rights." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Eleanor felt her knees go weak as she realized the scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just about recovering a stolen horse. Davidson was suggesting that Henry had been complicit in the original theft. "That's a serious allegation, Mr. Davidson," Henry said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I hope you have proof to back it up." I have enough proof to satisfy territorial law, Mr. Talbot. The question is whether we resolve this matter privately or involve the authorities in a more formal investigation. Eleanor stepped forward, her practical nature overriding her emotional turmoil. Mr. Davidson, exactly what are you proposing? Simple return of stolen property to its rightful owner. Mr. Rawlings is prepared to be generous. He understands that you've invested time and resources in the animal's care. He's willing to compensate you for reasonable expenses. And if we refuse? Henry's question carried an edge that made Eleanor's blood run cold. Then we pursue the matter through official channels. Sheriff's investigation, territorial court proceedings, potential criminal charges for receiving stolen property. Davidson leaned back in his chair. I'm sure you understand that such proceedings could be quite costly and time-consuming, regardless of their ultimate outcome. Henry moved around his desk with predatory grace, stopping just close enough to Davidson to make the other man unconsciously lean back in his chair. Mr. Davidson, I've been ranching in this territory for 25 years. My reputation for honest dealing is well established. If you're suggesting otherwise, I'm suggesting nothing, Mr. Talbot. I'm simply here to recover stolen property and resolve this matter with minimum disruption to all parties involved. Eleanor could see the dangerous territory her husband was entering. Henry's protective instincts were warring with his sense of justice, and the combination was pushing him toward a confrontation that could destroy everything they'd built. Perhaps we could see this horse, she said quickly, stepping between the two men. If Mr. Davidson is so certain of his identification, surely a visual examination would resolve the matter. Davidson nodded. I was hoping you'd suggest that, Mrs. Talbot. I have someone with me who's quite familiar with the animal in question. Eleanor's heart sank. Davidson hadn't come alone. He'd brought a witness, someone who could provide identification that would be difficult to dispute. The walk to the barn felt like a march to an execution. Henry's face had settled into the mask of controlled fury that Eleanor had learned to fear over their years of marriage. When Henry looked like that, he was capable of decisions that his rational mind would later regret. Miguel emerged from the equipment shed as they approached, taking one look at the group and immediately understanding that trouble had arrived. His weathered face showed no expression, but Eleanor noticed how his hand moved instinctively to rest on the handle of the knife he wore at his belt. Miguel, Henry said quietly, this is Mr. Davidson. He's here to look at our horses. The old foreman nodded politely, but his dark eyes remained fixed on Davidson with the wariness of a man who'd learned to judge character quickly and accurately. Red Dust was standing at his stall door when they entered the barn, ears pricked forward as if he'd been listening to their approach. In the weeks since his rescue, his condition had improved dramatically. His coat now gleamed with health, his eyes were bright and alert, and his bearing spoke of the magnificent animal he'd once been. Davidson stopped short when he saw the horse, his confidence wavering for the first time since his arrival. My God, he breathed, he's beautiful. A second man appeared in the barn doorway, older, graying, with the bow-legged gait of someone who'd spent his life on horseback. Eleanor didn't recognize him, but the way he moved and carried himself marked him as a horseman of considerable experience. Mr. Talbot, Davidson said, this is Frank Morrison. He was head trainer at the Rawlings Ranch when the horse was stolen. He knows the animal intimately. Morrison approached the stall with the careful movements of someone who understood horses could be dangerous. But as he got closer, Eleanor noticed his steps beginning to falter, his expression shifting from confident identification to something approaching confusion. Well, Davidson prompted, is this the horse? Morrison studied Red Dust carefully, taking in every detail of his appearance and bearing. The horse stood quietly under the examination, but Eleanor noticed how his attention remained focused on Henry throughout the process. The coloring's right, Morrison said slowly. Builds about what I'd expect. But what? This horse has scars that weren't there before, and he's older than he should be if this is really Thunder Valley. Eleanor felt a spark of hope. If Morrison couldn't make a positive identification, Davidson's case would collapse. "Horses age in the wild," Davidson said impatiently. "And of course he'd have new scars after 3 years of rough living." Morrison continued his examination, but his uncertainty was becoming more apparent. "The thing is, Thunder Valley had specific marks. A small notch in his left ear from a training accident. A scar on his right shoulder from a kick he took as a yearling." Eleanor's hope died as she saw recognition dawning in Morrison's eyes. These were exactly the marks they'd discovered during Red Dust's recovery details that perfectly matched the horse they all knew and loved. "The notch is there," Morrison said finally, "and the shoulder scar, but there's something else, wire embedded in the muscle that wasn't there before. Wire that was deliberately placed to hide a brand mark," Davidson said triumphantly. "Exactly what we expected to find." Morrison's examination revealed the partially obliterated brand with damning efficiency. The R of the Rawlings mark was clearly visible once you knew what to look for, though the rest had been successfully obscured. "That's Thunder Valley," Morrison said definitively. "No question about it. Someone tried to alter his brand, but they didn't do a complete job." Eleanor felt the world crumbling around her. The evidence was overwhelming, presented by a credible witness who had no apparent reason to lie. Even if they knew this horse was really Red Dust, how could they prove it against such compelling documentation? Henry stood silently throughout Morrison's examination, his face revealing nothing of the turmoil Eleanor knew he must be feeling. When the identification was complete, he simply nodded, as if accepting an inevitable verdict. "Mr. Davidson," he said quietly, "it appears you've made your point. Then you agree to return the horse?" Henry was silent for a long moment, and Eleanor held her breath, wondering what decision her husband was wrestling with. She could see the war being fought behind his eyes, between love and law, between what he knew to be true and what he could prove. "I need some time to consider the situation," Henry said finally. "This is a serious matter, and I want to make sure I handle it properly." Davidson's expression hardened. "Mr. Talbot, I'm afraid I can't allow you time to move the horse or otherwise complicate matters. If you won't agree to immediate return, I'll have to involve the territorial authorities." "How much time are we talking about?" Eleanor asked, stepping between the two men once again. 24 hours, long enough to arrange transportation and complete the necessary paperwork. It wasn't much, but it was something. 24 hours to figure out how to prove Red Dust's true identity, to find evidence that would counter Rawlings' elaborate deception. 24 hours, Henry agreed. "But the horse stays in my care until this matter is legally resolved." Davidson nodded curtly. "Agreed. But I'll be posting a man here to ensure the animal doesn't disappear during negotiations." After Davidson and Morrison left, Henry remained in the barn with Red Dust, his hand resting on the horse's neck in a gesture of both comfort and farewell. Eleanor found him there an hour later, still standing in silent communion with the animal he'd thought lost forever. "Henry, we have to fight this." "With what?" "They have documentation, witnesses, physical evidence. Everything points to their version of events." Eleanor reached into her apron pocket and withdrew something she'd been carrying since their marriage began, her wedding ring. But now she held it differently, not as a symbol of commitment, but as a weapon in the war for her husband's soul. "I won't let them take him again," she said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "Red Dust belongs here, with you. And if the law won't protect that truth, then maybe we need to find another way." Henry looked at his wife with surprise and something approaching wonder. In 25 years of marriage, he'd never seen Eleanor prepared to bend the law for anything. But here she was, ready to fight for a horse she'd initially seen as nothing more than a reminder of loss. "What are you suggesting?" Eleanor slipped her wedding ring back onto her finger, but the gesture felt different now, not a surrender to circumstances beyond their control, but a reaffirmation of their partnership in the face of impossible odds. I'm suggesting that sometimes the right thing and the legal thing aren't the same, and I'm suggesting that red dust has already survived 3 years of hell to get back to you. Maybe it's time we showed the same kind of determination." Outside the barn, storm clouds were gathering with ominous intensity, and Eleanor couldn't help but feel they were an omen of the fight that lay ahead. 24 hours to save everything that mattered, it would have to be enough. The evening passed in tense preparation and whispered conversations. Eleanor had taken charge of gathering supplies, while Henry worked with Miguel to prepare the old line camp for an extended stay. The plan was desperate but simple. Get red dust away from the ranch before Davidson could formalize his claim, then find some way to prove the truth about the horse's identity. But as dawn approached, Eleanor was struck by a terrible realization. In all their planning, they'd been thinking like people with something to hide, rather than people with a truth to reveal. If red dust was really Henry's horse, then running would only make them look guilty of the exact crime Davidson was alleging. "Henry," she said, finding him in the barn as he prepared to load red dust into the trailer, "we're making a mistake." "Eleanor, we've been through this. We don't have enough evidence to fight Davidson's claim through legal channels." "No, but we have something better. We have the truth." Henry paused in his preparations, hearing something in his wife's voice that made him turn to face her fully. Eleanor stood in the barn doorway with her shoulders squared and her chin raised in the determined posture he'd learned to recognize over 25 years of marriage. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that if this is really red dust, then running away with him is exactly what a horse thief would do, but if we're telling the truth, then we should act like it." Before Henry could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles shattered the morning quiet. Through the barn doors, they could see a small convoy heading up the main road, Davidson's expensive carriage, followed by what looked like a territorial sheriff's wagon. "They're early," Henry said grimly. "Or maybe they're right on time," Eleanor replied. "Henry, I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Something in her tone made him nod without questioning her plan. In all their years together, Eleanor had never led him astray when the stakes were high. "Miguel," Eleanor called to the foreman, who was watching the approaching vehicles with obvious concern, "bring red dust out to the main corral, and Miguel, bring Henry's father's branding equipment too." Henry's eyes widened as he understood what his wife was proposing. "Eleanor, that's the proof we need," she said firmly. "If this horse really is red dust, then somewhere under that altered brand is the original Talbot mark. And if Davidson is so confident in his identification, he won't object to a public demonstration." The convoy pulled into the ranch yard with an official gravity that made Henry's stomach clench. Davidson emerged from his carriage looking smugly satisfied, followed by a territorial sheriff Henry didn't recognize, and several men who had the bearing of legal witnesses. "Mr. Talbot," Davidson called across the yard, "I trust you've had time to consider your position." "I've had time to consider a lot of things, Mr. Davidson, including the question of what exactly happened to my horse 3 years ago." Davidson's confidence wavered slightly at Henry's tone. This wasn't the defeated man he'd expected to find. This was someone prepared for a fight. "Your horse?" "My horse," Henry confirmed, moving to stand beside red dust in the corral. "The question is whether you're confident enough in your identification to submit to a public test." Eleanor stepped forward, carrying the branching iron and a small brazier she'd prepared. "Mr. Davidson, you claim this horse carries a Rawlings brand that's been deliberately altered. If that's true, then removing the scar tissue should reveal the original mark clearly." The sheriff, a grizzled man named Porter who'd held his position for 15 years, studied the situation with the careful attention of someone who'd seen his share of property disputes. "That's an interesting proposal, Mrs. Talbot," he said slowly. "But brand alteration is a serious crime. If we're going to examine this horse's markings, it needs to be done officially, with proper witnesses and documentation." "Agreed," Eleanor said immediately. "But I'm also proposing that we test another theory. If this horse has been living wild for 3 years, as Mr. Davidson claims, then he should have no memory of human training or specific commands. Davidson frowned. What are you suggesting? Eleanor moved to stand beside her husband, and Henry saw something in her eyes that he'd never seen before, the fierce determination of a woman fighting for everything she loved. I'm suggesting that Thunder Valley, if that's who this is, would have no reason to respond to the specific commands and signals that Henry used to train Red Dust. But if this is Red Dust, then 3 years of wild living shouldn't have erased a lifetime of partnership. The challenge hung in the morning air like a thrown gauntlet. Davidson consulted quietly with Morrison, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as the implications of Eleanor's proposal became clear. This is highly irregular, Davidson protested. The brand identification is sufficient for legal purposes, but it's not sufficient for the truth, Eleanor replied. And since you're so confident in your identification, you shouldn't object to additional evidence. Sheriff Porter stepped forward, his authority settling over the gathering like a heavy blanket. I think Mrs. Talbot has made a reasonable request. If this horse is truly wild-caught, as you claim, then human commands shouldn't mean anything to him. But if he responds to specific training, that raises questions about his history. Henry found himself caught between admiration for his wife's courage and terror at what they were attempting. If Red Dust didn't respond, if 3 years had truly erased their partnership, then Eleanor's gamble would backfire spectacularly. But as he looked into the horse's dark eyes, he saw the same intelligence that had always been there, the same alert attention that suggested nothing important had been forgotten. All right, Henry said quietly, let's see who this horse really is. He moved to the center of the corral, Red Dust following without being led. The simple act of walking together drew murmurs from the watching crowd, the kind of synchronized movement that spoke of deep familiarity. Henry stopped and turned to face the horse, their eyes meeting in the moment of perfect communication he'd thought lost forever. Then, without touching Red Dust or using any verbal command, he shifted his weight slightly and turned his shoulders to the left. Red Dust responded instantly, moving into the flowing left-hand circle that had always been their warm-up routine. Henry's body language guided the horse through increasingly complex patterns, flying lead changes, sliding stops, spins that showcased the animal's athletic ability and their seamless partnership. The crowd watched in stunned silence as man and horse moved through a routine that could only have been developed over years of careful training. This wasn't the behavior of a wild Mustang. This was the demonstration of a bond that no amount of hard living could break. But Eleanor wasn't finished. Henry, she called from the fence. The silver bit. Henry's breath caught as he understood. Eleanor had brought more than branding equipment. She'd brought Red Dust's favorite bit, the silver inlaid piece that had been made specifically for his mouth and his preferences. With hands that trembled slightly, Henry approached Red Dust with the distinctive bit. A wild horse would resist unfamiliar tack, especially something as personal as a bit designed for a specific animal. But Red Dust lowered his head immediately, accepting the bit with the familiarity of long association. The effect on the watching crowd was electric. Morrison stepped forward, his face pale with the realization of what he was witnessing. That's impossible, he breathed. Thunder Valley never wore anything like that bit. The Rawlings horses used standard equipment. Davidson's confident facade was crumbling as the evidence mounted against his claims. But Eleanor wasn't finished with her revelations. Sheriff Porter, she said, I think it's time we examined that brand mark more carefully. The examination revealed what Eleanor had suspected beneath the scar tissue, and wire damage was not a Rawlings R, but the clear outline of the Talbot family brand. The T, with its distinctive star, was partially visible, and careful scraping revealed enough of the original mark to make identification certain. My God, Sheriff Porter said quietly, someone did alter this brand, but not to hide a Rawlings mark to create one. The implications hit the gathered crowd like a physical blow. Morrison's identification hadn't been mistaken, it had been deliberately false. The elaborate documentation Davidson had presented was part of a conspiracy to steal red dust legally, using forged evidence and perjured testimony. "Mr. Davidson," Sheriff Porter said, his voice carrying the weight of territorial authority, "I think you and I need to have a very serious conversation about fraud and conspiracy charges." Davidson's face had gone ashen as his scheme collapsed around him. "This is all a misunderstanding. The documentation I have is legitimate. The documentation you have is forged," Eleanor said calmly, "and Mr. Morrison's identification was perjury. The question now is whether you're going to cooperate with the investigation or whether we need to pursue this matter through federal courts." As Sheriff Porter began placing Davidson and Morrison under arrest, Henry remained in the corral with red dust, both of them breathing hard from the emotional intensity of their reunion performance. The horse stood quietly beside him, occasionally nuzzling his shoulder in the old familiar gesture of affection. "Welcome home, old friend," Henry whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I never gave up believing you'd come back." Eleanor joined them in the corral, her face radiant with triumph and relief. The gamble had paid off, truth had prevailed over deception, and red dust was home where he belonged. But as she watched her husband's joy, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles weren't over. Someone had orchestrated an elaborate conspiracy to steal red dust, and Davidson's arrest wouldn't necessarily end the threat. The horse had survived 3 years of captivity and had somehow found his way home, but keeping him safe would require vigilance that might last the rest of their lives. For now, though, it was enough that the miracle had been acknowledged, the truth had been revealed, and the bond between Henry and red dust had proven stronger than any human scheme to destroy it. The hidden brand mark that had nearly been their downfall had become the key to their salvation, and Eleanor felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that sometimes justice really could prevail against impossible odds. The storm clouds that had been gathering for days finally opened, releasing rain that washed the dust from the desert and seemed to cleanse the air of deception and lies. Henry and Eleanor stood together in the corral with red dust, letting the rain fall on all of them as they celebrated a victory that felt like a resurrection. The arrest of Davidson and Morrison sent shockwaves through the territory that reached far beyond the Talbot Ranch. Within days, territorial investigators had uncovered evidence of a sophisticated horse theft ring that had been operating for years, using forged documentation and bribed officials to legitimize stolen animals. Red Dust's case had blown open a criminal conspiracy that threatened the livelihood of honest ranchers throughout New Mexico. But Henry found little satisfaction in the vindication. As he worked with Red Dust in the days following their dramatic reunion, he was haunted by questions about what his horse had endured during those 3 missing years. The scars told part of the story, evidence of harsh treatment, inadequate care, and the desperate attempts to erase his true identity. But Red Dust's eyes held memories that Henry could only imagine, experiences that had marked the horse's spirit as surely as the wire had marked his body. Eleanor watched her husband wrestling with these ghosts, understanding that their victory had come at a cost neither of them had anticipated. Recovering Red Dust had healed one wound, but opened another, the terrible knowledge of what they'd both lost during those years of unnecessary separation. "You can't blame yourself for what happened," she told Henry one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Red Dust graze in the evening light. "You did everything you could to find him." "Did I?" Henry's voice carried a weight of self-doubt that surprised her. Looking back, there were signs. Reports of horse thieves working the area, rumors about altered brands. "Maybe if I'd been smarter, more suspicious, you would have searched even harder than you did, which was impossible." "Henry, you nearly killed yourself looking for that horse. Miguel told me there were times he was afraid you wouldn't come back from those searches." Henry was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Red Dust's familiar silhouette against the darkening sky. 3 years, Eleanor, 3 years of his life stolen, and 3 years of mine wasted on grief that didn't need to happen. Not wasted, Eleanor said firmly. Those 3 years taught us both what really matters, and they made this reunion possible. If you hadn't grieved so deeply, you might not have recognized him when he came home. The investigation into the theft ring had revealed disturbing details about Red Dust's captivity. Sheriff Porter had shared what he could without compromising the ongoing case. The horse had been sold to a series of buyers, each time with increasingly sophisticated documentation that made the transactions appear legitimate. His final owner had been a wealthy collector in Colorado who'd kept him as a breeding stallion, never knowing he was working with stolen goods. The investigators want to interview you about Red Dust's training, Eleanor continued. They think his unique responses to your commands could help identify other stolen horses that were trained by their original owners. Henry nodded absently. The territorial authorities had been respectful but persistent in their requests for information. Red Dust's case had become the key to unraveling a criminal network that stretched across 3 territories, and Henry's testimony would be crucial in bringing the remaining conspirators to justice. But the prospect of reliving the theft, of detailing exactly what made Red Dust special enough to steal, filled Henry with a mixture of pride and protective rage. The bond between them had been forged over years of patient work, built on trust and understanding that couldn't be duplicated or replaced. To have that intimacy violated by thieves who saw only monetary value felt like a personal violation that went beyond mere property crime. A rider approached from the main road, moving at the measured pace of someone on official business. Eleanor recognized the territorial marshal's uniform before she could make out the man's face. Another investigator, another request for information about the case that had consumed their lives. "Mr. Talbot," the marshal called as he dismounted near the porch. "Marshal Williams, Territorial Office. I apologize for the late hour, but I have information that couldn't wait for morning." Henry rose from his chair, his body language shifting into the defensive posture Eleanor had learned to recognize when he felt Red Dust was threatened. "What kind of information?" "We've arrested James Rawlings. He was trying to flee the territory with a wagon full of forged breeding documents and stolen registration papers. But that's not why I'm here." Williams reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather pouch that looked ancient and worn. "We found this among Rawlings' possessions. According to our Apache contacts, it's a medicine bundle, the kind given to mark spiritual significance." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine as Williams handed the pouch to Henry. The leather was soft with age and decorated with symbols she didn't recognize, but something about it felt deeply significant in a way she couldn't explain. "What does this have to do with Red Dust?" Henry asked, turning the bundle over in his hands. "According to the Apache elder we consulted, this particular bundle was made for a horse spirit that had been lost and was seeking its way home. The symbols indicate a journey through great hardship that ends in reunion with its true companion." Henry's hands trembled as he examined the intricate beadwork and carved symbols that adorned the medicine bundle. "Are you saying the Apache knew about Red Dust?" "I'm saying they knew about a special horse that belonged with a certain man, and they believed that horse would find its way back when the time was right. Rawlings had this bundle because he understood its significance. He was using Apache knowledge to track and steal horses that had spiritual as well as monetary value." The implications hit Henry like a physical blow. The theft of Red Dust hadn't been random or opportunistic. It had been specifically planned because someone had recognized the unique bond between horse and rider. Rawlings had stolen not just an animal, but a relationship that others had identified as sacred. "The Apache elder wants to meet with you," Williams continued. "He says the medicine bundle belongs with the horse and his true companion, and he wants to ensure it reaches its proper home." Eleanor watched her husband's face as he processed this information. The revelation that Red Dust's return had been foretold, that their bond had been recognized and honored by people who understood the spiritual connection between humans and horses, seemed to overwhelm him with its significance. "When?" Henry asked quietly. Tomorrow, if you're willing, he's traveled a long way to complete this ceremony, and he says the timing is important, something about the autumn moon and the completion of circles. That night, Henry couldn't sleep. He found himself in the barn before dawn, sitting in Red Dust's stall and trying to process everything that had happened. The horse stood quietly beside him, occasionally lowering his great head to nuzzle Henry's shoulder, in a gesture of comfort that seemed to acknowledge the emotional turmoil his human was experiencing. "Did you know?" Henry asked aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you somehow know you'd find your way back to me?" Red Dust's dark eyes reflected the lantern light as he regarded Henry with the same intelligence that had always set him apart. There was something in that gaze that suggested understanding beyond what should have been possible, an awareness that their separation had been temporary, that their bond was stronger than human schemes or natural disasters. Eleanor found them there as the sun was rising, man and horse, in the same position they'd occupied years ago during their first partnership. But something was different. Now there was a gravity to their connection that spoke of trials endured and faith vindicated. "The Apache elder is here," she said softly. "He's waiting by the corral." The old man was small and weathered, his face marked by decades of desert sun and mountain wind. But his eyes held the same alert intelligence that Henry recognized in Red Dust, and when he looked at the horse, his expression softened with something approaching reverence. "You are the man who lost his heart horse," the elder said, his English accented but clear. "And you are the horse who traveled the spirit paths to find his way home." Henry nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "This bundle was made when the horse first disappeared," the elder continued, holding up the leather pouch. "Our medicine man saw the theft in a vision and created this to guide the horse's spirit back to its proper place. Rawlings stole it because he understood its power, but he could not use it. The medicine only works for true partnerships." The ceremony that followed was simple but profound. The elder burned sage and sweetgrass, chanting in a language Henry didn't understand, but somehow felt in his bones. Red Dust stood perfectly still throughout the ritual, as if he understood the significance of what was happening. When it was finished, the elder placed the medicine bundle in Henry's hands. "This belongs to both of you now. It will protect the bond that brought you back together and ensure that no force can separate you again." As the elder prepared to leave, he turned back to Henry with a final piece of wisdom. "The horse chose to return to you, even when escape was possible. That is the strongest medicine of all love, that chooses to come home." Eleanor watched from the porch as Henry stood in the corral with Red Dust, holding the medicine bundle and finally understanding the full scope of what they'd recovered. It wasn't just a horse that had been returned to them. It was a relationship that had been blessed by forces beyond their understanding, protected by beliefs older than territorial law, and sustained by a love that had proven stronger than human greed or natural catastrophe. The territorial horse fair was only 2 weeks away, and Eleanor could see Henry's mind working through the possibilities. For years, he'd avoided public demonstrations of his horsemanship, unable to bear the reminder of what he'd lost. But now, with Red Dust restored and their bond vindicated, the fair represented an opportunity to show the world what true partnership looked like. "Are you thinking what I think you're thinking?" Eleanor asked, joining him in the corral. Henry smiled for the first time in days, his hand resting on Red Dust's neck as he contemplated the future. "I'm thinking it's time to remind people what this territory was built on, the bond between humans and horses, and the belief that some things are worth fighting for, no matter what the odds." The medicine bundle felt warm in his hands, and Red Dust nickered softly, as if agreeing with the plan. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were home, whole, and ready to face whatever came next, with the confidence of those who had already overcome the impossible. The territorial horse fair had drawn crowds from across New Mexico and beyond. What had started as a regional gathering of ranchers and horse traders had evolved into something approaching a festival, with the news of the Rawlings conspiracy adding an element of drama that attracted spectators from as far away as Colorado and Texas. Henry stood at the edge of the main arena, red dust beside him, both of them watching the preliminary competitions with the calm attention of professionals assessing their field. The Horse Fair's championship event, a demonstration of partnership between horse and rider, carried a trophy that represented more than mere recognition. It was validation of everything the territory stood for, acknowledgement that the bond between humans and animals was the foundation upon which their civilization was built. Eleanor found them there, noting the way they stood together in perfect symmetry, each aware of the other's mood and position without conscious effort. 3 weeks had passed since the medicine ceremony, and the change in both man and horse was remarkable. Red Dust had regained not just his physical condition, but his confidence, while Henry moved with the assured grace of someone who had recovered his purpose in life. "The territorial governor is here," Eleanor said, settling beside her husband. "Word has spread about what happened with Davidson and Rawlings. People are calling it the crime of the decade." Henry nodded absently, his attention focused on the competition taking place in the arena. A young cowboy was attempting to demonstrate his partnership with a spirited paint horse, but their movements lacked the fluid coordination that marked true partnership. Good technique, adequate skill, but missing the indefinable quality that separated competence from artistry. "Nervous?" Eleanor asked. "No," Henry replied, and realized he was telling the truth. For the first time in years, he felt completely at peace with himself and his circumstances. Red Dust's return had restored something in him that he'd thought lost forever, not just happiness, but confidence in the fundamental rightness of the world. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the fairgrounds as the championship event approached. Henry had entered their names almost as an afterthought, responding to encouragement from neighbors who remembered his reputation from before Red Dust's disappearance. But as the crowd began to gather around the main arena, he realized this performance had taken on significance far beyond a simple horse fair competition. Miguel approached, leading Marshall, the solid bay gelding Henry had ridden during the years of Red Dust's absence. The contrast between the two horses was instructive. Marshall was reliable, well-trained, and perfectly adequate for ranch work. But beside Red Dust, he looked ordinary in the way that competence always paled beside brilliance. "Senor Henry," Miguel said quietly, "there are people here who traveled long distances to see this. Don't let the pressure change what you and Red Dust do naturally." It was good advice. Henry could see the expectant faces in the crowd, could feel the weight of their attention and their hopes. The story of Red Dust's theft and return had captured the territory's imagination, becoming a symbol of justice, prevailing and lost things finding their way home. People needed to believe in such stories, especially in a land where hardship was common and happy endings were rare. "We'll just be ourselves," Henry said, more to Red Dust than to Miguel. "Same as always." The horse fair's master of ceremonies, a portly man named Henderson, who served as auctioneer for most territorial livestock sales, called for attention as the championship event prepared to begin. His voice carried easily across the fairgrounds, drawing spectators from other activities to witness what everyone was calling the main attraction. "Ladies and gentlemen," Henderson announced, "we have 6 entries in today's championship demonstration. Each team will have 10 minutes to show the crowd what true partnership between horse and rider looks like. Our judges will be looking for communication, trust, athletic ability, and that special quality that can't be taught or faked, the bond that makes horse and human into something greater than either could be alone." The first competitor was a professional trainer from Santa Fe, mounted on an expensive Arabian that moved with the collected grace of formal dressage. Their performance was technically flawless, precise movements, perfect timing, demonstration of advanced techniques that few horses could master. The crowd appreciated the skill involved, applauding politely when the 10-minute demonstration concluded. But Eleanor noticed something missing from the performance joy: The Arabian was obedient and well-trained, but he worked with the mechanical precision of a creature, following commands, rather than the enthusiasm of a partner engaged in shared adventure. The second and third competitors showed similar technical competence without the spark that elevated good horsemanship into art. Henry watched each performance carefully, not as a competitor studying rivals, but as a horseman appreciating the efforts of others who shared his passion. When his turn came, Henry led Red Dust into the arena with the unhurried confidence of someone completely comfortable in his surroundings. The crowd fell unusually quiet as they entered, the magnitude of what they were witnessing suddenly apparent to everyone present. This wasn't just another horse fair competition, this was the public validation of a story that had captured the territory's imagination. Red Dust's ears were pricked forward, his attention focused not on the crowd, but on Henry's subtle signals. 3 years of separation hadn't dimmed their communication, if anything. The ordeal had deepened their understanding of each other. Henry mounted without ceremony, settling into the saddle with the easy grace of someone for whom horseback was the most natural position in the world. For a moment, they simply stood in the center of the arena, man and horse perfectly still, as they prepared for what everyone sensed would be something special. The demonstration began without fanfare, a simple walk that showcased the horse's fluid movement and the rider's quiet seat. But as they moved into more complex gaits, the crowd began to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't training on display, this was partnership in its purest form. Red Dust's responses to Henry's aids were so subtle as to be nearly invisible. A slight shift in weight would send them into a flowing canter. A barely perceptible touch of the rein would initiate turns so smooth they looked like dancing. Most remarkably, there were moments when they seemed to be communicating without any visible signals at all, horse anticipating rider's intentions with an understanding that bordered on telepathic. Eleanor found herself holding her breath as she watched her husband and Red Dust move through their routine. This was the partnership she remembered from their early years together, but refined by experience and deepened by the knowledge of how precious and fragile such connections could be. The athletic display's sliding stops, flying lead changes, precise spins drew gasps from the crowd, but it was the quieter moments that truly showcased their bond. When Henry dropped the reins entirely and guided Red Dust through complex patterns using only seat and leg, the arena fell silent except for the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats on packed earth. As their 10 minutes drew to a close, Henry and Red Dust stood once again in the center of the arena. The horse's sides were barely moving, his breathing calm and regular despite the athletic demands of their performance. He looked out at the crowd with the composed dignity of an animal, completely confident in his abilities and his place in the world. The silence stretched for several heartbeats before the crowd erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. People were standing, cheering, some wiping away tears as they witnessed something that reminded them why they'd chosen to build lives in this challenging territory. But Henry's attention was focused entirely on Red Dust, his hand resting on the horse's neck in a gesture of gratitude and affection. They had done more than win a competition. They had shown the world what was possible when trust and love overcame every obstacle that circumstances could place in their path. The territorial governor himself rose from the judge's stand, his political instincts recognizing the symbolic power of what had just occurred. This wasn't just about horses or ranching, this was about the human spirit's capacity to triumph over adversity, about the bonds that made civilization possible in places where nature offered few second chances. Ladies and gentlemen, Henderson's voice cut through the continuing applause. I believe we have witnessed something extraordinary today. The judges are unanimous in their decision, but more importantly, we have all been reminded of what makes this territory special, the belief that some things are worth any sacrifice to preserve. Eleanor made her way toward the arena, her heart full of pride and joy, and a deep satisfaction that came from seeing justice finally done. The trophy they would win meant less than nothing compared to what they had already recovered, but the public acknowledgement felt like a blessing on everything they'd endured to reach this moment. As she reached the arena fence, she saw Henry dismount and stand beside Red Dust, both of them calm and centered, despite the chaos of celebration around them. The medicine bundle hung from Henry's belt, a reminder that some victories were blessed by forces beyond human understanding. The crowd continued to cheer, but Eleanor could see that her husband's attention was already turning toward home, toward the quiet satisfaction of another day's work well done. The championship was theirs, but more importantly, their family was whole again, and the future stretched before them full of promise and possibility. The trophy presentation became something more than a simple award ceremony. Territorial Governor Samuel Morrison, no relation to the disgraced horse trainer, had requested the honor of presenting the championship award personally, recognizing that this moment carried significance far beyond a local horse fair. Henry stood beside Red Dust in the center of the arena, still somewhat overwhelmed by the magnitude of the crowd's response. The applause had finally died down, but the energy in the air remained electric, charged with the collective emotion of people who had witnessed something that reminded them why they believed in second chances. "Mr. Talbot," Governor Morrison began, his voice carrying easily across the fairgrounds, "3 weeks ago, this territory learned about a conspiracy that threatened the foundation of honest ranching, the trust between neighbors and the sanctity of property rights. But today, we've witnessed something that reminds us what we're really fighting to preserve." The governor held up the championship trophy, a handsome silver cup engraved with symbols representing the partnership between humans and the land they worked. But even as he spoke about awards and recognition, Henry's attention remained focused on Red Dust, who stood quietly beside him with the composed dignity of a horse completely comfortable in his own skin. "This partnership we've witnessed today represents more than athletic skill or training expertise," Morrison continued. "It represents the kind of bond that built this territory, the understanding that some relationships transcend mere utility and become something approaching sacred." Eleanor watched from the edge of the arena, her heart full of pride and a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with public recognition. She could see the way Henry's posture had relaxed, the way years of tension and grief had finally released their hold on his shoulders. This was the man she'd married, confident, purposeful, at peace with himself and his place in the world. But it was Red Dust who truly commanded her attention. The horse stood with the regal bearing of an animal who had endured great hardship and emerged not just unbroken, but somehow strengthened by the experience. His coat gleamed in the afternoon sun, his eyes were bright and alert, and his entire demeanor spoke of a creature who had found his way home and intended to stay there. "The judges were unanimous in their decision," Governor Morrison announced, though everyone present had already reached the same conclusion. "But more importantly, today's demonstration has reminded us all that some things, loyalty, partnership, the bond between companions, are worth any sacrifice to preserve." As the trophy was formally presented, Henry felt the weight of more than silver and engraving in his hands. This award represented vindication of his faith during the darkest years of his life, acknowledgement that his refusal to give up hope had been wisdom rather than foolishness. Red Dust turned his head to nuzzle Henry's shoulder, the familiar gesture drawing a fresh wave of emotion from the crowd. Here was proof that love could survive separation, that trust could endure betrayal, that the bonds forged between kindred spirits were stronger than any force that might try to destroy them. "Speech!" someone called from the crowd, and the cry was quickly taken up by others. Henry looked around at the expectant faces, realizing that people needed to hear something that would help them make sense of what they'd witnessed. He stepped forward, the trophy balanced in one hand while the other rested on Red Dust's neck. For a moment, he simply looked out at the crowd, gathering his thoughts and trying to find words adequate to the occasion. "3 years ago," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "I lost the best partner I'd ever had. I searched everywhere, followed every lead, refused to give up hope, even when everyone told me I was chasing ghosts. The crowd had fallen completely silent, hanging on every word, as Henry shared the story they'd all heard fragments of, but never in his own voice. I learned something during those years of searching, that grief can make you bitter, or it can teach you what really matters. I chose to let it teach me that some relationships are worth fighting for, no matter how impossible the odds seem. Red dust shifted beside him, and Henry automatically adjusted his position to maintain their connection, a small gesture that perfectly illustrated the point he was trying to make. This horse found his way back to me through circumstances I still don't fully understand. But I know this: he didn't just return to his old home. He returned to a partnership that had been blessed by forces greater than either of us, protected by love that proved stronger than human greed or natural disaster. Henry held up the medicine bundle that hung from his belt, its leather surface worn smooth by generations of hands that had understood the sacred nature of certain bonds. An Apache elder told me that Red Dust chose to come home, even when escape was possible. That's the strongest medicine of all: love that chooses to return, partnership that endures every test, faith that refuses to accept defeat. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet, deeper, more contemplative, charged with the recognition that they had heard something important. These were people who understood hard choices and long odds, who had built lives in a place where failure was common and success had to be earned daily. When the applause finally came, it was sustained but respectful, the kind of acknowledgement reserved for moments that touched something fundamental in the human spirit. Henry found himself looking out at faces that reflected his own journey, neighbors who had endured their own losses, couples who had weathered their own storms, individuals who understood what it meant to keep faith when circumstances suggested that hope was foolish. Eleanor made her way into the arena, her presence at Henry's side, completing the picture of a family restored to wholeness. She took his free hand, while his other remained connected to Red Dust, the three of them forming a unit that spoke of bonds tested by adversity and proven unbreakable. "Thank you," Henry said simply, addressing the crowd but speaking to the larger forces that had made this moment possible. "Thank you for believing that some stories deserve happy endings." As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Henry found himself surrounded by well-wishers and old friends who wanted to congratulate him on Red Dust's return. But even as he accepted their good wishes and shared details of the horse's recovery, part of his attention remained focused on the larger significance of what had occurred. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a public affirmation of values that defined their community. The belief that loyalty should be rewarded, that perseverance could overcome any obstacle, that the bonds between partners, whether human or animal, represented something sacred that was worth defending against any threat. Red Dust accepted the attention with the gracious dignity of a horse accustomed to being admired, but Henry could sense his partner's growing restlessness. Like himself, Red Dust was fundamentally a creature of action rather than ceremony, more comfortable working than being celebrated. "Ready to go home?" Henry asked quietly, and Red Dust's immediate response, a soft nicker and a step toward the arena gate, provided all the answer he needed. The drive back to the ranch took place in comfortable silence, Eleanor and Henry sharing the wagon seat, while Red Dust followed behind, loose and relaxed in the way of a horse who knew exactly where he was going. The trophy sat between them, catching the late afternoon light, but its gleam seemed less important than the simple satisfaction of another day's work. Well done. As they crested the hill that offered the first view of their ranch buildings, Henry felt a profound sense of completion. This was where they belonged, not in the spotlight of public attention, but in the quiet rhythms of daily life. Partners in the ongoing work of building something lasting in a land that demanded everything from those who chose to call it home. The sun was setting as they reached the ranch yard, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Henry why he'd fallen in love with this country in the first place. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were home, whole, and ready to face whatever came next with the confidence of those who had already overcome the impossible. Red Dust walked into his stall with the satisfied air of a horse who had proven his worth and was ready for a well-deserved rest. As Henry removed the halter and hung it on its familiar peg, he realized that this simple gesture marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a future built on foundations that had been tested by fire and proven unbreakable. 6 months had passed since the territorial horse fair, and the Talbot Ranch had settled into rhythms that felt both familiar and wonderfully new. Henry woke each morning with the eager anticipation of a man whose life had regained its purpose, while Eleanor moved through her days with the contentment of someone whose deepest prayers had been answered in ways she'd never dared hope. The most visible change was in the ranch's operation itself. Word of Red Dust's return and their championship performance had spread far beyond New Mexico territory, drawing visitors and potential clients from across the Southwest. Henry found himself reluctantly returning to the horse training business, accepting a select few animals whose owners understood that working with Henry Talbot meant patience, respect for the animal's nature, and a commitment to partnership rather than mere dominance. But the real transformation was subtler, visible in the way Henry carried himself and the quality of attention he brought to every aspect of his work. The grief that had shadowed him for 3 years had been replaced by a quiet joy that colored even mundane ranch chores. Eleanor often found herself pausing in her own work, simply to watch her husband moving through his day with the fluid confidence of someone completely at peace with his circumstances. Red Dust had become something of a local legend, though he seemed entirely unaware of his celebrity status. He spent his days in the familiar routines that had always defined his life: morning workouts with Henry, afternoon grazing in the home pasture, evening grooming sessions that served as much for companionship as for practical care. The years of hardship had left their mark in scars and lines that would never completely fade, but his spirit had emerged from the ordeal somehow strengthened rather than diminished. The investigation into the horse theft conspiracy had concluded with convictions that sent shockwaves through the territorial livestock community. Rawlings received a 20-year sentence for organizing the theft ring, while Davidson and Morrison faced shorter terms for their roles in the conspiracy. But Henry took little satisfaction in their punishment. Justice mattered less to him than the simple fact that Red Dust was home where he belonged. Eleanor had become something of a celebrity herself, her role in exposing the conspiracy earning recognition throughout the territory. The story of how she'd engineered the confrontation that revealed the truth about Red Dust's identity had been repeated and embellished until it took on almost mythic proportions. But she remained fundamentally unchanged by the attention, continuing to manage the ranch household with the same practical efficiency that had always been her hallmark. On this particular morning, Eleanor stood at the kitchen window watching Henry work, with a young mare whose owner had traveled from Texas seeking his expertise. The horse was spirited but not mean, confused rather than vicious, and Henry's patient approach was already yielding results. She could see the animal beginning to trust, beginning to understand that cooperation brought rewards rather than punishment. "He's got the touch," Miguel observed, joining Eleanor at the window. The old foreman had been watching Henry's renewed engagement with horse training with the satisfaction of someone who'd never stopped believing in his employer's abilities. "He always did," Eleanor replied. "He just forgot for a while. See, but now he remembers. And the horses, they remember too. Word is spreading that Henry Talbot is training again, and that's good news for honest horsemen everywhere." Eleanor nodded, though her attention was drawn to the paddock where Red Dust grazed peacefully, occasionally lifting his head to watch Henry's work with the young mare. There was something proprietary in the stallion's attention, as if he understood his role as mentor to the other horses that came and went from the ranch. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the main road, where a rider was approaching at the easy lope of someone on a social rather than urgent mission. Eleanor recognized Dr. Matthews, the territorial veterinarian who'd become something of a regular visitor since Red Dust's return. "Morning, Eleanor," Matthews called as he dismounted near the porch. "Henry around? Working with the Harrison mare. What brings you out this way?" Matthews grinned, the expression of someone bearing good news. "Wanted to check on our celebrity patient, and I have something that might interest you both." Eleanor led him toward the training paddock, where Henry was concluding his session with the young mare. The horse was moving with the relaxed gait of an animal whose confidence was returning, responding to Henry's subtle cues with growing trust. "Doc," Henry called, bringing the mare to a halt near the fence. "Good timing. This little lady is about ready to go home to her family." "That's what I like to hear. But actually, I'm here about Red Dust. Had some interesting visitors yesterday, folks from the Territorial Livestock Association. They want to register him as a foundation sire for a new breeding program." Henry's expression grew thoughtful. The idea of Red Dust siring foals was appealing, but the logistics of a formal breeding program concerned him. What kind of program? Something designed to preserve the qualities that make horses like Red Dust special: intelligence, heart, the ability to form deep partnerships with humans. The association thinks his bloodline could be valuable for developing horses specifically suited to this territory. Eleanor saw her husband considering the proposal, weighing his desire to keep Red Dust's life simple and private against the opportunity to pass on the stallion's remarkable qualities to future generations. "Would mean visitors," Henry said finally. "People coming to evaluate mares, bringing animals for breeding, changes the whole character of the place." "Not necessarily," Matthews replied. "They're talking about a very selective program. Maybe 1 or 2 carefully chosen mares per year, owners who understand what they're getting into. Quality over quantity." As if summoned by the conversation, Red Dust appeared at the paddock fence, his attention focused on the group of humans discussing his future. Henry moved to scratch behind the horse's ears, and Red Dust leaned into the contact with obvious contentment. "What do you think, old friend?" Henry asked quietly. "Ready to be a father?" Red Dust's response was a soft nicker that seemed to express general satisfaction with life as it currently existed. But Eleanor noticed something else. A young mare in the adjacent pasture had moved closer to the fence, drawn by Red Dust's presence in the way that suggested natural attraction rather than mere curiosity. "Henry," Eleanor said, pointing toward the mare. "Look at that." The mare was one of their own, a 3-year-old chestnut with white markings that echoed Red Dust's coloring. She'd been born on the ranch during the years of Red Dust's absence, sired by Marshall and out of one of their older broodmares. But standing near Red Dust, the resemblance was striking enough to suggest deeper connections than mere coincidence. "Well, I'll be," Matthews said, studying the pair. "That's interesting bloodline convergence, almost like the ranch was preparing for Red Dust's return without knowing it." Henry found himself smiling at the idea. The notion that some greater pattern had been working itself out over the years of separation, preparing for reunion and renewal, appealed to his sense of how the world ought to work. "Maybe we start small," he said finally. "See how Red Dust takes to the idea of being a family man." The decision felt right in the way that major choices sometimes did, not because all the practical considerations had been perfectly balanced, but because it aligned with something fundamental about their circumstances and their hopes for the future. Over the following weeks, Red Dust's introduction to his potential mate proceeded with the careful deliberation that characterized all of Henry's work with horses. The young mare, whom they'd named Sunrise for the golden highlights in her chestnut coat, proved as intelligent and willing as her coloring had suggested. The partnership that developed between the two horses was different from Henry and Red Dust's human-animal bond, but equally compelling in its own way. where Henry and Red Dust's relationship was built on work and shared challenges. Red Dust and Sunrise seemed to communicate through subtle exchanges that spoke of deeper, more instinctual connections. When Sunrise's pregnancy was confirmed in early spring, Henry felt a satisfaction that went beyond the practical advantages of adding quality bloodlines to their breeding program. This foal would represent continuity, not just of Red Dust's genetic heritage, but of the values and relationships that had defined the best years of Henry's life. Eleanor found him in the barn one evening as Sunrise's due date approached, sitting in Red Dust's stall and talking quietly to both horses about the changes that were coming. The scene reminded her powerfully of the early days of their marriage, when Henry's work with horses had been driven by passion rather than mere professionalism. "Nervous?" she asked, settling beside him on the straw. "Excited," Henry replied. "Feels like everything's coming full circle. Red Dust home, the ranch thriving, new life on the way. Hard to believe it's only been 8 months since we thought we'd lost him forever." Eleanor leaned against her husband's shoulder, both of them watching Red Dust and Sunrise in the comfortable silence of animals at ease in their surroundings. The medicine bundle hung from its place of honor on the stall wall, its presence a reminder that some blessings came from sources beyond human understanding. "Think he knows?" Eleanor asked, nodding toward Red Dust. "Oh, he knows. Look at the way he's been watching over her, making sure she gets the best grazing spots, keeping the other horses from bothering her. He's going to be a good father." The foal arrived on a clear morning in late May, a perfect chestnut colt, with his father's intelligent eyes and his mother's gentle disposition. Henry was present for the birth, and he would later swear that Red Dust's expression during those first moments showed a pride and tenderness that transcended mere animal instinct. They named him Hope, partly for the circumstances of his conception, partly for what he represented about second chances and the continuation of extraordinary legacies. Watching him take his first uncertain steps, then quickly gaining confidence under his parents' watchful supervision, Henry felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with monetary value or breeding programs. This was what they'd fought to preserve, not just individual animals, but the ongoing relationships that made ranching more than mere business. Hope represented the future of everything they'd worked to build, the promise that Red Dust's remarkable qualities would continue into the next generation. As the sun set over the desert landscape, painting the familiar mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Henry stood at the corral fence, watching 3 generations of horses, Red Dust, Sunrise, and their new son moving together in the eternal rhythms of family life. Eleanor joined him there, her hand finding his in the gesture of partnership that had sustained them through the darkest years and now blessed their return to happiness. The territorial horsefair trophy sat on a shelf in Henry's study, tarnishing slightly in the desert air, but retaining its symbolic significance. More important than any award, though, was the knowledge that some bonds truly were unbreakable, that love really could overcome any obstacle, and that patience and faith sometimes received rewards beyond imagination. Red Dust nickered softly to his son, the sound carrying across the evening air like a blessing on everything they'd built together. Henry squeezed Eleanor's hand and smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but confident that they would face them as they always had together, with faith in each other and in the fundamental goodness of a world where miracles sometimes wore the disguise of horses finding their way home.